Terrence, you talked to our group today about mediations between adults and between students, and you really focused a lot on like those being centered in relationships.
Yes.
Can you talk to our audience a little bit about like why those moments need to be centered in relationships and not about just moving to another thing to do on our checklist?
I mean, one of the number one reason why those moments need to be centered in relationships is that that's what culture is. We have to get back to we are human beings that are fit within a context, in a timeline, and our expressions or ways of being is our culture. And what we do sometimes is we take whatever the new hot word is, and we put it on a strategic plan, or we write it in a new motto for our school or ourselves, and we say, oh, we're restorative. Well, if on paper it says you're restorative, but in practice you don't build relationships, it's not restorative. That's just not what it is. So a lot of times it's about getting us to the space to where what we say about our culture is consistent to the lived experience of our culture. Are the youth experiencing restoration? Are the staff experiencing spaces of affirmation and restoration? And the only way you'll get to a space that's actually restorative in practice is through relationships, because I'm dealing with human beings. If this was dealing with robots and algorithms, it would be way easier, right? You just go ahead and take your code, and you're going to tell the algorithm what to do, what to look for, and you step away from it, right? But we're dealing with human beings, which means we have to build the capacity for you, one, to affirm your own humanity in your engagement with your cohort or with your colleagues or with the students that you're serving, and then to always be reaffirming the humanity of the youth we're serving. So that's just the idea of culture being our ways of being. But the thing we can never forget is that while we are people with cultures that sit in the timeline, we also are dealing with the context. Mm-hmm. The youth that we serve here in Chicago, the youth that Noble serves across this city, are coming from communities where in media they are dehumanized. In lessons, they are dehumanized. One of the things that Spicer talked about is he talked about, how there's these ways that we talk about youth and the things that they sometimes believe or these skills they don't have, and with the concept of good or bad students. And what we have to realize is when we're moving into a space that's liberatory and it's actually dealing in restorative practice, we have to question why it's so easy for us to believe that the malfunction is the human and not the policies, practices, and ways of being that we have conditioned that human to exist in. Mm-hmm. So we call the student bad, but we don't call our practices and our policies bad. And that action that we're doing, that action is called institutional sovereignty. That's where you believe that the institute is sovereign and sinless and right, and that the humans have to prove to the institute why they're worthy of being a part of it. A lot of the exclusionary practice that we see in our spaces is because we've looked at human beings and we've said, you're going to be unpeopled. You're not human no more, right? You need to fall in line. You need to do this. You need to do that. I don't have to deal with your context. I don't have to deal with what you experienced before you got here. I don't have to deal with, what's happening in your real life. You just need to fall in line. And that's not how we do. None of us want that, right? None of us want that in our workspaces. None of us want that in our personal relationships. Try to pull that off with my wife. That's not going to work, right? So how about we rehumanize our spaces, and in rehumanizing our spaces, we recognize that nothing's going to happen without relationships. So when we talk about mediations, many times we just thinking about there was a conflict or a disruption, and we want everybody to calm down and be okay with each other. And I wanted us to rethink that.
Why do they want them to calm down and get okay with each other?
Yeah, because
what's the purpose? Like, what are they trying to
want to move
on.
on.
There you go. They want to move on to
whatever it is. Whether I want to finish lunch or I want to do these other practices. And I think sometimes in our institutions we get so disconnected from the humanity that we sometimes forget what schools are for. Yeah. Right? They're like the youth that are with us, they're learning. They're either learning that they are fully human, deserving of dignity, and that they have supportive adults that want the best for them and that love them and express that love through a commitment to restoration, or they're learning that there are some institutions that I have to live in, and I have to live in the space of fugitivity. I got to learn how to be me, even though the way I am is not what they want from me. And that's what many of our schools have been. And we know that fugitivity. That's the talking in the back of the room. I know what the dress code is, but I wore this anyway, right? Because what do human beings do when there's not relationship? We resist. We resist. That resistance at your school might be gross disrespect. That resistance at another school might be always having your cell phone when you shouldn't. But when we feel as if we're in spaces where there's only transactional relationships, we resist those spaces. So I wanted them to get away from the idea that this is just about the I'm responding to a fight, and more I'm responding to a tear or wear and tear in the relationships in our space, and how do we heal those relationships and get into a space where we can all be affirmed, we all can feel safe, and we can thrive. And so that's really what we want to dig into from the adult side, and kind of speaking to some of the ways that we as adults make missteps around mediation. And so we talked about, not being experts in the lived experience of our youth. Our youth are experts in their own lived experience. It's been 20 years since I was a high school student. So how dare I walk in and think I know what it's like to be a high school student in the middle of a pandemic? Like I couldn't even begin to understand that, right? So I think that's why it's important for us to kind of talk to those ways that we kind of make missteps in mediations, and do some realignment on our purpose of our mediations. And I know that it was perfect for me because I got to talk about what are the adult responsibilities in building this space. And then Spicer got to come right behind me and say, okay, well, if we're going to build these practices with you, then we also need to be building the capacity within our youth to do mediations themselves. And so that was a great scenario.
Changing that mindset from thinking that what we're doing is just to check off a box to this is about humanity. This is about me seeing you.